This is Sunday Times best-selling author Scott Lynch, who is here in London as part of the Gollancz Festival of Books.
And this is four-time Hugo winner Elizabeth Bear, author of 26 novels and at least 108 short stories and counting. And she is also here in London as part of the Gollancz Festival of Books. The more times we say Gollancz Festival of Books, the more they pay us. So, Gollancz Festival of Books.
Gollancz Festival of Books. I think magic is not essential in fantasy because the book I'm thinking of in particular is Nicola Griffith's Hild, which was out last year, I believe. And the protagonist of this is a historical character, Hild, who is Saint Hildegard eventually, but not in the context of this book. She's a prophetess. She's a seer. And she earns her living with the king she serves as a seer. But she doesn't actually have any magic powers. What she has is a really good set of observational skills and aspiring. But I think it's definitely a fantasy. I mean, it's a historical fantasy. It feels like a historical fantasy, but there's no patent magic in the book. There are miracles, but we see all the stage magic behind the miracles. That is the where you can go with that and still have it be a fantasy novel.
Magic is just a flavor. Magic is one of the... magic is awesome, don't get me wrong. I love magic. It's going to figure in some fashion in nearly everything I ever write. But it's not essential any more than anything else is essential. I mean, a band is still a band, even if it's minus a rhythm guitarist or a bassist. If it's, three people rather than 4 or 5, it's still a band.
Morphine is still a band.
Yeah, Morphine is still a band. Yes, you what do they have, an upright bass and 2 saxophones?
No, a bass player who only plays the bottom 2 notes and a
two-string bass.
And a baritone saxophone.
Bass.
Yeah,
yes.
It's a 2-string bass and a baritone saxophone.
Mm-hmm. It's
still a band.
It's a tool. It's an instrument. It's one strand in the tapestry. It's neither essential. It's characteristic, but not essential. Let's go with that. That sounds scholarly.
That does sound scholarly. Who are you, and what have you done?
I
with
don't
Scott
know.
Lynch?
What did I drink for lunch? Fantasy encompasses everything. Fantasy is everything, and all other forms of literature are essentially subsets of fantasy with more strictures or a narrower playing field. The characteristics of a good fantasy are the characteristics of good literature itself. Intriguing human characters, accurate psychological portraits, vivid landscapes, beautiful prose. I mean, not every novel can achieve all these things, and some would argue that none of my novels ever achieve these things. But the more of these buttons you can push, the better a book you're going to have in general. There are no separate rules for fantasy, separate and distinct from the rest of literature and human art and craft.
There are, I think, some things that are characteristic of many good fantasy novels. One of them is the numinous, the access to a liminal space or a different world. And sometimes we often use numinous to mean exalted, but for me, it can also be some of the things that, for example, Joe Abercrombie's books do, where there is a numinousness to them, but it's not a pleasant or particular. There is a sense of a very particular kind of world that is fantastical and dark and dangerous, and to me, that's also a kind of energy that informs the best fantasy. The fantasy that, to me, loses its momentum or loses its attraction is the stuff that feels very mundane in a bad way. It feels like there is no exploration of a different world. There is no illumination of our world. There is nothing to compare and contrast, and to. It's not. I mean, Richard Brautigan, the poet Richard Brautigan, said, "God-forsaken is beautiful too," and I think that defines the kind of fantasy I'm talking about here. It can be a very difficult world, but it still has a kind of weird beauty to it. Having written both science fiction and fantasy, to me they are different tools that we use to do some of the same things. We are always writing to a modern audience. We are writing to our peers and our parents and our children and our complete strangers who happen to be sharing the same space and time that we are. We're also writing to posterity, but you can't think about that too much, I think, or you freeze up. And that's a first person you. When I say you, I mean me. Science fiction uses many of the same tricks that fantasy does, in that it constructs an argument by changing certain basic things about the world that we know. The things that it changes are different. In science fiction, you are kind of stuck with the rules of physics. You're stuck with thermodynamics. In fantasy, you can have sort of superpower. I mean, and there's the old joke about any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. So you have that blurred future line, the Arthur C. Clarke, where you have the aliens who are so powerful they seem like magicians, they seem like wizards. But in science fiction, there's a faith sort of that anybody can do that if they learn enough. And in fantasy, there is more often a sense that sometimes things just are what they are. They're fated. They're immutable. What's interesting to me is that some recent science fiction works, I'm thinking of Peter Watt's Blind Sight, have really taken on board the idea that there is no free will, that human behavior is predetermined, that we can't make any changes in ourselves, that everything is prophesied, basically. And that is to me, an emotional theme that has more often been explored in fantasy. So I sometimes think that the differences are more cosmetic when you consider the entire range of science fiction and fantasy, that the differences are more cosmetic than structural.
Science fiction and fantasy have been kissing cousins, totally intertwined and totally meeting as a continuum for as long as they've existed as distinct commercial entities. And you have a great mixing and melding of all of these various flavors in the weird fiction and the horror fiction and sort of the proto-science fiction that predated the sort of emergence of the markets, the emergence of the big magazines of the 1930s and the so-called golden age of science fiction. At that point, you had Fritz Leiber, you had Robert E. Howard, you had C.L. Moore, you had Lee Brackett, you had all the people predating them. You had William Hope Hodgson, you had Manly Wade Wellman. I mean, you had such fluid notions of H.P. Lovecraft and company, Clark Ashton Smith, such fluid notions of what is scientific and what is fantastical, and they blended together, and then there came a sharper distinction after the fact. So there's this sort of high church approach to science fiction, where science fiction has always been this edifice that is not to be contaminated by the mutterings of mere fantasists. Never existed. These flavors have always been side by side and totally wound around one another.
What's interesting to me is that there are certain flavors of things that we know or know, quote unquote, barring more discoveries, are impossible, that are sort of grandfathered into science fiction, even though they are more on the fantasy side of things as far as I'm concerned. Time travel, telepathy. The Lensman books are a great example of this. Yeah. They're space opera, and in many ways they're sheer fantasy, but they're classed as science fiction.
Yeah, space opera and planetary romance and psionic fantasies, and so these are, so far as these take the laws of thermodynamics and beat them senseless. There's very little scientific about them, but they are science-y. They are presented in a veneer of scientific nomenclature and images. And it doesn't mean that I don't love them. It just means that I'm a huge fan of the Lensman sequence by E. Doc Smith in all of its glorious, archaic clunkiness and questionable life choices. But it is at its heart, it's rip-roaring fantasy, wide open fantasy.
And I think if you look at many of the founding fathers and mothers of modern science fiction and fantasy, you'll see that they moved very fluidly from one genre to another. I grew up in a household where Roger Zelazny and Ursula Le Guin were very high on the reading lists, and these are people who have both written epic fantasies, hard science fiction, and stuff that straddles the line.
Yeah.
And I think it's a spectrum. It's not a dichotomy.
Zelazny and Jack Vance and Fritz Leiber, in particular, especially in the tradition defined as sword and sorcery, is a very oftentimes scientific approach to fantasy. You have sly hints of technologies and ages beyond the sword and sandal milieu. You also have a scientific approach to fantasy, to the codification of magic and the worlds in which these characters exist. It's always been this entire series of authors who were absolutely willing to take toys out of any sandbox they found and put them together as they saw fit. And I guess that's the tradition that I really, really want to continue to push boldly forward.
I want to be Roger Zelazny when I grow up.
I want to be Roger Zelazny when I grow up.
Okay, I'll be Ursula.
By our powers combined, form of Roger Zelazny. We can't both turn into Zelazny. One of us has to be a bucket of water. Writing is wonderful, and I will.
It beats the hell out of answering telephones.
It really does. I was preparing to chop salads for a living when I sold my first novel, quite by accident. I prefer writing. It's very, very wonderful, and it's part hard work, part dumb luck. The paths down which we fall in our lives, to end up being able to do exactly what we want to do, which really is this. I wanted to be a cartoonist. Unfortunately, I can't draw, so it had to be writing. Writing was plan B. I could do that.
It turns out you're okay at it.
Writing is the slacker's cartooning. It's not enough to be interested in the idea of being a writer, because we run into these people at conventions and at writers' workshops and so on and so forth. There are obviously some people who want to write, and some people who merely want to be a writer because they have half-assed, nonsensical, romantic notions about what it means and what it entails. And the only way to actually be a writer is to write. There's this popular image of it's a quick path to riches and wealth and accolades and yes I suppose I am no, actually I don't have any of that. That's never happened.
You have to have glasses and good hair. No.
You've got to believe in your work. You've got to believe in doing the work. You've got to see a hole in store shelves. You've got to see a blank spot on library shelves where there's a book that you want to exist that doesn't exist yet. That's where first novels come from. We write to fill holes in the world around us. And we write in reaction to what we've already read. We write to emulate what we've already read.
Or to argue with it.
Or to take it to the mat and beat the crap out of it. To do better. It is that urge to create and to write which is unsuppressible. And if that is what you have, then congratulations, you have the most important thing. Do the work, finish the work, actually write a novel.
Submit the work.
Yes, and then you have to show the work to other people.
Well, I would say that my advice to young writers in general, young writers, unpublished writers, aspiring writers, journeyman writers, which I sort of like better than aspiring writers as a term, because it implies the amount of work that needs to go into the process. First of all, I would say that the foremost advice I have is to learn everything you can about everything that interests you, because it will all come in useful when you are telling stories. The more you know, the more interesting things you have to say. The other thing that I would say is that there are 4 or 5 aspects to learning, to the process of becoming a successful writer. One of them is to have a certain amount of talent. Another is to do an extraordinary amount of work. If you have more talent, you can do less work. I was not a particularly talented young writer. I was pretty good at characterization, but my prose style was atrocious, and I could not follow a narrative line to save my life or my dog's life. And I would probably, so there's that. There's also willingness to listen to criticism. You have to be able to look at your own work and realize that it's not perfect, because if you can't, you'll never learn. And then you actually have to sit down and do the work, write the stories, finish them, send them out, and then write a different new story with some of the things you have learned.
You should read however many hundreds or I mean, there are many, many, many thousands of novels under the bridge between the two of us over the years.
Read stuff you don't like. Read stuff that's bad. Read stuff that's broken.
Go back years later.
Go back years later to things you liked and read them again, and to things you disliked and read them again.
You will have a totally different reaction to stuff you read at 15, at 25, at 35, and so on and so forth.
And nonfiction. Read a lot of nonfiction too.
And buy 10 or 15 copies of everything we write. That's a big, big assist.